All right. Hello, everyone. I'm pleased to have Reverend Dr. Mario Anthony Russo with me here today. Mario is a lifelong Christian, and he has a bachelor's in science in both biology and psychology from the University of South Carolina. He has a master's in religion from Reformed Theological Seminary and a doctor in ministry from Erskine Theological Seminary. And he runs the Dortmund Center for Science and Faith in Dortmund, Germany, which empowers churches to engage their fellowship through a better understanding of the relationship between science and faith. Sorry, having microphone problems here. And he works with churches and schools to promote a better understanding of science and faith. So, welcome, welcome, Mario.
Thanks so much, John. It's great to be here.
Great. Oh, and I forgot to mention, you also have a YouTube channel, the Dortmund Center for Science and Faith, and I'll put a link to that channel in the description below.
Oh, wonderful. Yeah, that would be great. Thanks so much.
Wonderful. So where in Germany is Dortmund?
It's in Western Germany, so we're just north of the cities of Cologne and Dusseldorf. Most folks kind of know where that is.
Yep.
Or the larger city of Hamburg, which is about 4 hours north of us. We're about 4 hours south of Hamburg. So, but it's Western Germany. We're not far from the borders of France and the Netherlands.
Okay, wonderful. And how did you happen to come to Dortmund to live?
Yeah, that's a wonderful question. It's a long story, but the short version is my wife and I are both church planters, and so we went through a long process of prayer and also just kind of seeking the counsel of our churches and pastors and people in our lives and just kind of pursuing God's will. And the opportunity opened up for us to move to Dortmund as church planters, and so that's kind of our primary work and what we do. And the Dortmund Center for Science and Faith is one of the platforms that we have as part of our church planting work. So it's a means for us to engage in the community here in Dortmund. It's a chance for us to connect with churches in the Dortmund area and to share the gospel and then help the church planting efforts. So.
Wow, that's wonderful. What do you like most about living in Germany?
Well, I think for me, there's lots of different benefits to it. Being centrally located in Europe is convenient to other countries. My wife and I love to travel to new places we've never been before, so it's very convenient to getting around Europe, driving on the Autobahn. The food is really interesting as well. There's some new we've tried in Americans, so that's been fun. But I think one of the biggest strengths or positives, especially as a church planter, is the long history with Martin Luther and the Reformation here in Germany. So as someone who's trying to engage culture and with the gospel, there's a little bit of a foundation, at least, that's remained over the last 500 years, where people are at least familiar with the story of Martin Luther, with the history. There's somewhat of an understanding of religious thought that remains within the culture, and so it can be a contact point for us as we engage people in the community.
Interesting. And faith and a man of science, what testimony can you give to any listeners and watchers who are perhaps exploring Christianity and wondering, maybe harboring some doubts about whether there's compatibility between those things?
Yeah, it's a great question. My own story, I wrote about this for the Biologos Foundation, and I kind of wrote up my story, and they published it. I grew up very conservative Christian ideas, and I grew up believing that there were 6 literal 24-hour days. I grew up as a Young Earth Creationist. I was a volunteer at Answers in Genesis. I would go for 2-3 weeks at a time for several years and volunteer at their headquarters in Louisville, Kentucky. I've interviewed Ken Ham for my, I used to do a radio show, and I've interviewed Ken Ham several times. I've interviewed many Answers in Genesis speakers. And so for me, I loved, one of the things that I loved about Answers in Genesis and the Young Earth Creationist movement is they offered answers to questions. And so it got to the point for me where it was almost like an addiction. I loved having answers to questions or to responses to atheist arguments and people who would question the Bible. And so I loved that. But once I got into seminary, and I actually learned some tools about how to interpret the Bible well, and read the Bible well, I went back and re-examined my beliefs on Genesis. And so there was a point in time for me where I doubted what I believed, and I think that's good. I think it's healthy. It's okay, and it's certainly okay to doubt. So I think for your viewers, if there's the question of is it okay to doubt, what would you do with someone who doubted their beliefs from the ring? I would say it's perfectly okay to doubt. Doubt is not a sin.
Great. So you had what turned out in the end to be a positive experience with going through a period of doubt and emerging on the end with a more resilient faith. It doesn't always happen that way. There are a lot of people who grew up in a young Earth creationist culture, and when they run into a faith crisis because of it, they wind up giving up their Christianity. What would you say was what held it together for you during that whole process? And
yeah, I think one of the key things for me was recognizing early on the compatibility between science and Christianity. I think one of the reasons, and there are many, but I think one of the reasons, if not one of the primary reasons, that people end up going through a faith crisis and rejecting their faith is because they look at science and they see how much it contradicts what they've been taught about Christianity, not necessarily how it actually contradicts with Christianity. And so what they end up concluding is, well, if science is contradicting my faith, I've got to choose between one or the other. And I'm coming to believe that what I've been taught isn't true, and science is true, and therefore I have to leave and reject Christianity, and I have to cling to science. And that, for me, early on, I didn't have that false dichotomy, if we can call it that, that false choice between either or. For me, I knew the Bible was true. I knew Christianity was true. And so what I wanted to know was to get down to the truth. And when I re-examined my own beliefs, I rejected a lot of what I was taught, but I didn't reject God. I didn't reject Christ. I didn't reject Orthodox Christian teaching. And what I found was that the young earth creation perspective is a perspective, but it's not the perspective. It's not the only Orthodox view that you can hold as a Christian, that there are people who love Jesus with all their heart and believe in evolutionary science. They accept the evolutionary science. So because you can do both, I didn't have to choose between one or the other. I could fully embrace both, that there is a triune God who has created the world through evolutionary means. And I could also look at and study and appreciate evolutionary science and get excited about it. I could actually study evolutionary science and be amazed and be struck about the just the wonder of God and Christ as a creator in a whole new way that I had never experienced before. So for me, accepting evolution and Christianity deepened my faith because I didn't have to choose between either one of them. I could accept both of them. And so it just brought a much greater depth to my faith than as a creationist. So I think the key is if you're going to question and you're going to doubt your faith and you're going to come out the other end with your faith intact, don't go into that question and at periods of doubt and the periods of questioning, understanding that you don't have to give up your faith. You can embrace the science and faith, and those two are inherently compatible.
Great. So were there any key moments in that process, any key turning points, either with recognizing that you could read the Bible in a way that does not present a conflict with science, but also understanding the science itself, coming to grips with evolution and recognizing, oh, this is really true? Yeah.
I think one of the big things was reading books and articles from people who wrote for the positions that for the other side. Okay. So I had devoured, as a teenager, Young Earth Creationist books and blogs and discussion forums. And I would read anything and everything I can get my hands on by a Young Earth Creationist. But I had never really actually read books by theistic evolutionists or what are now called evolutionary creationists. Or by old Earth creationists. Hugh Ross was a very bad name in my circles, so I would never read anything by Reasons to Believe. Yeah, so for me, one of the turning points was when I actually sat down and I started to read books by people who held to other positions other than Young Earth Creationism. And I got to read their arguments from them rather than read their arguments as they had been interpreted through Young Earth Creationist writers. I began to realize, oh, so what they say actually does make sense. The Earth, the geological data for the age of the Earth actually is really reliable. The astronomical data for light years and millions and billions of years in astronomical time really is believable. It's really good science. So if the geology is really good science and the astronomy is really good science, why are we to believe that the biology isn't going to be really good science? Right. And so then I started examining the biological science and realizing, okay, this really does make sense. And then from there, it was just a simple matter of, so then asking the question, okay, so then how do we reconcile the evolutionary biology science with scripture, particularly with Genesis and the creation story? And so as I started reading other perspectives, I don't want to say I was humble, because that sounds terrible, but rather than reading it with a competitive eye and saying, I'm going to just prove these theistic evolutionists, I'm going to prove them wrong, I said, okay, I'm going to read this as a learner. I'm here to learn. And tell me what it is, how you reconcile evolutionary biology with Genesis creation story. And for me, they did. They were very convincing. And they said, here are other orthodox ways of interpreting the creation story. And for me, it all made sense. So I think those were big turning points for me, was learning to accept the science and then reading other people's positions, the opposing side's positions, so to speak, which eventually actually led me to joining the opposing side.
Great. Now transitioning a little bit, once we accept an old earth and read the Bible in light of not being in conflict with science, and we believe in evolution, there's some further sort of issues that come up sometimes. And one thing I'm trying to understand better, and I think a lot of people are trying to understand better, is how to make sense of suffering, especially in light of evolutionary creation. It seems that suffering is sort of baked into the process, and that suffering and disease and disability and even death were around long before humanity came along. So how can we make sense of suffering?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's an area that I've actually been researching more recently, because this is an area that for me is not just the crux of the matter. It's not just the big problem that Christians have. This is the big problem that non-Christians have. As we were talking earlier that my wife and I are church planners here in Germany, and we engage a lot with non-Christians. And whenever we engage in any kind of theological conversation with a non-Christian, it doesn't take longer than 5 minutes before the question of the problem of evil and the problem of suffering come up. And so this is an area where I've really wanted to do more reading and more research, and I would encourage anyone who has questions to do more reading and research in this area. But there's some really good questions, and if you engage at all in social media with creationists or evolutionary creationists and that whole sphere in different Facebook groups, for example, one of the immediate first objections that Young Earth Creationists have to evolutionary creation is, well, what about death before the fall? There can't be death before Adam's fall. So this is very often hailed as a trump card to accepting theistic evolution or evolutionary creation. So it's a great question. I think there's two kind of perspectives that we need. There's two kind of main answers we can give to the question of suffering and the question of death. And so the first thing I would say is that death is a part of God's good creation. While death itself may not be good, it is a part of God's good creation. It has to be. Otherwise, you don't get a good creation. And I think one of the major points that is pointed out is, I think it's Ted Davis, but I'm not entirely sure. But there's an article on the Biologos website where they talk about this as well. And that is, if you don't have death before the fall, then what you don't have is a good ecosystem and a good environment. Now, God said after day 7 that everything he had made was very good, which means that the earth, it's as a whole, as in a giant ecosystem and the sub-ecosystems within those ecosystems and the whole environment is very good. In order to have a very good environment, a very good ecosystem, it is absolutely essential that you have death within the ecosystem. If you don't have death in an ecosystem, what you end up with is a tremendous amount of suffering, because you have organisms reproducing out of control. You have organisms that are not in balance with the whole ecosystem. So the whole ecosystem gets out of whack and is completely out of balance. And what you have is actually a really bad creation. But we know from Genesis 1 that God said his creation was very good. And therefore we have to assume, based on that statement, that death was a part of that very good creation, because without death, you get an environment and an ecosystem that's completely imbalanced, completely out of whack, completely non-sustainable, and not an environment that's conducive to human or plant or animal flourishing. And without death, you can't have human, animal, and plant flourishing. So we know death had to be a part of God's good creation long before Adam and Eve fell. Otherwise, it wasn't a very good creation, and you make God out to be a liar. So that would be the first thing I would say. Death has to be a part. While death itself is not very good, death has to be a part of a very good creation. Otherwise, you don't get flourishing. The second thing I would say is there have been several authors who have pointed out with the question of suffering. What do we do with the question of suffering? John Hott and Celia Dean Drummond are two Roman Catholic theologians, and they have done a very good job of sort of framing our understanding of suffering from a different perspective. When we talk about evolution and its compatibility with the Bible and theology, we talk about it in terms of design. Did God design? How is he involved in the evolutionary process? Did God design evolution? Did God design animals? And is evolution kind of the agent or the means by which God as designer creates? And that we think of it in this framework of design. And what John Hott particularly has done, and I think he's done a great service to Christian theology in doing this, is he says we have to get rid of that entire mindset of design. It's a bad mindset going into reading this conversation between science and faith. Get rid of design. William Paley's argument has been killed, put to death, laid to rest. It needs to be moved away. Instead, what we need to do is we need to focus on the evolutionary narrative in terms of drama. Not design, but drama. This is an unfolding story. When we look at evolution from Big Bang all the way to Big Ben, what we get is an overwhelming sense that life has greater meaning and purpose than simply the reproduction of organisms over time, but that there's a deeper meaning to the evolutionary narrative. And he says, when you think about it like that evolution is about drama, not design, then the question of suffering becomes a lot easier to understand. Of course you have suffering within the context of a drama, because it wouldn't be drama if you didn't have some type of conflict, if you didn't have if you think of it like you're watching your favorite television show or your favorite movie. I'm a huge Lord of the Rings guy. I love Lord of the Rings. So if you imagine if we had Lord of the Rings where Frodo and Sam could just jump on the eagle, fly to Mount Doom, throw the ring in, and boom, movie's over in 10 minutes. But you wouldn't have any drama. You wouldn't even have a movie. You wouldn't have a plot. But the whole story of Frodo having to suffer through carrying this burden on behalf of humanity, and eventually getting to all of the problems that he faces, all the suffering he goes through to eventually reach the point where the ring goes into Mount Doom and is destroyed. By the time you get to the end of the trilogy, there's an entire story of suffering. And not just Frodo suffering, but all of his friends are suffering. And it's that suffering that builds the drama, that makes the story so meaningful and enrapturing and captivating, and makes you want to keep reading it, and why they spend millions of dollars making movies about it and television shows, because that suffering creates the drama that provides meaning and purpose in the whole overall narrative. And so John Hott would say, and I would agree with him, that when we cast it in that light, suffering makes a whole lot more sense, and it's a lot easier to understand than when we try to think of suffering in terms of design. Why would a perfect engineer create a world possible with suffering when he could just engineer a perfectly designed world? Because we shouldn't think of it like that. We need to think of it in terms of drama and not design.
And it strikes me that we see a lot of drama throughout Scripture.
Yeah, absolutely. With the redemptive narrative, starting with Genesis all the way through Revelation, there's a tremendous amount of drama and suffering and contention and conflict that goes with it. Absolutely.
Okay, wonderful. So one transitioning actually to design. Within the realm of Christianity, the streams of thought regarding science are not limited to Young Earth Creationism and Evolutionary Creationism. There's also ID, intelligent design. Now, as I understand it, ID itself is not offer a theory. It's not itself a theory of how life came to be. It's more a critique of evolution. It says evolution can't be true because life is irreducibly complex, because the Cambrian explosion happened too quickly, because there's not enough time for all the necessary mutations to have taken place, and all that, and so forth. So, question is, I've heard you say somewhere, and I forget exactly where, and I'll let you correct me if I've misquoted you, that you feel ID is, if anything, maybe more of a problem that needs to be addressed and debated within the church than even Young Earth Creationism is. Is that the case? And if so, why?
Yeah, it's a great question. I don't know if it's more of a problem, but I think it's more of just borrowing from Peter to pay Paul. It's you're just exchanging one set of problems for another. You're not really making any progress with the intelligent design movement. I think. And there's, I mean, we could do a whole podcast episode just critiquing the intelligent design movement. But I think if you just boiled it down, there are some things that we can greatly appreciate about the intelligent design movement, and that its attempt to kind of explore questions of complexity. And I think it's a great, it's a valiant attempt to account for certain complex things in nature. And I think it's great. I think where they go a little bit too far, in my opinion, is in trying to somehow promote themselves as a scientific theory or a scientific idea or framework that can somehow replace evolutionary science. And so I think that's first of all, I think that's their first mistake is they try to promote the idea as a scientific idea rather than what it is, which is more of a philosophical, theological idea. But then I think their second mistake is the whole reason for their existence, essentially, is because they want to find a better explanation for evolution by natural selection. Well, my question is why? Why do you want to find a better explanation for evolution by natural selection? Isn't evolution by natural selection doing a good enough job? And of course, they would answer, well, no, it's not. So then the question is, well, why not? And when you get down to it and you read William Dembski and you read Michael Behe's books and Philip Johnson, you kind of get to the heart of the matter. What you find out is really the whole reason intelligent design exists is because they conflate evolution by natural selection with philosophical naturalism, or what is called scientific materialism, or scientism, which is the simple belief which Richard Dawkins and the New Atheists, Sam Harris, will happily tell you, is the belief that the material world is all that exists, and science is the best tool that we have for investigating that world. And so therefore, science is really all we need to build a cohesive worldview. Well, of course, that's complete garbage. 99.9% of philosophers who are atheists would reject atheism and scientism. But intelligent design falsely conflates philosophical naturalism with evolutionism. With evolution by natural selection. Evolution by natural selection is a purely scientific idea. Right. It's been tested, it's been verified. But because they conflate that with philosophical naturalism, they say, well, now we have to get rid of with evolution by natural selection and we can replace it with intelligent design. But if I can simply show that evolution by natural selection is not philosophical naturalism, well, now I've completely dismissed the entire need for intelligent design.
Yeah, it's sort of like they've fallen into a trap, I think, myself, and that they've accepted some atheist argument that evolution does show that there's no God, and they've said, okay, well, we're going to prove evolution is wrong. And in reality, maybe the danger perhaps is that when Christians start accepting and really getting into intelligent design, it maybe prevents them from, and gives them an excuse to not accept evolution, which is maybe where they should be going. Is that sort of part of the problem with intelligent design, is that it prevents the church from moving forward towards accepting evolution, evolutionary creation?
Yeah, I would say, yeah, it might be twofold. It might be that it stops, it holds the church back from just fully accepting the evolutionary science, which the church needs to do. The church needs to be at the forefront of science. Too often throughout the recent past has the church been behind science. And by behind science, I mean it's had to play catch up with science, where the scientists were kind of leading the way and the church was very skeptical, which is understandable. But at the same time, the church should be the one that most of what we have today in terms of modern science, we owe to the church. The church has what has given us modern day science, modern day medical advancements. I want the church to get back to that. I want the church to be back out front, the one that's promoting, leading, financing, driving good science. And when we have people who are like, well, evolution is this or that, or evolution means that God doesn't exist, we have to reject evolution and replace it. These are just people who are preventing the church from taking their rightful place as the head of the line, leading the charge for scientific advancement. And instead, they're just holding people back to just bad ideas, bad philosophy that doesn't really help or promote anyone or anyone's growth and maturity in Christ. And in fact, it does the opposite. It keeps people clinging to false ideas that end up causing them to doubt their own faith. And eventually, as you and I were talking about just a few minutes ago, it causes them to eventually leave the faith entirely. And so what they set out to do is give people answers from an apologetic standpoint to keep the faith. And instead they can very much be contributing to people leaving the faith.
Yeah. So if you be able to have a conversation with someone who's really into intelligent design, and they generally had an open mind, but we're reading the books of Michael Behe and Stephen Meyer and those guys, and you just had a few minutes to chat with them, and you could share with them one concept or one argument or one key that would sort of hopefully turn them aside from intelligent design and show them that the arguments are not sound. How might you use that brief amount of time you had to make one key point?
Yeah, I would probably split the time in half. I would split the time in half, and I would say I would talk about the strengths of the intelligent design, which is their contributions to understanding complexity, which are very helpful. They're very helpful, understanding specified complexity and irreducible complexity. They're not perfect, but they are making some valuable contributions to our understanding of complexity, which is wonderful. Those are good things. I would want to affirm that those things are good and they're helpful and they're edifying. But then I would very quickly point out that the major problem, if I only could pick one, would be that conflation between evolution as natural selection and scientism, philosophical naturalism. And you run into all kinds of danger when you do that. And you end up making a lot of mistakes that you don't need to make. And you end up losing a lot of credibility as someone who can't make that nuance and that distinction. And that's very important, because there are a lot of Christians who are scientists, who are evolutionary biologists, who fully embrace evolution by natural selection, and they're not philosophical naturalists. They're not atheists. They're committed, faithful, evangelical Christians.
Yeah. No, that's great. And
again, it goes back to what we talked about earlier. You got to emphasize that compatibility. What the reason people reject the faith is they see it as a choice between an either or. Either I stay in Christianity in the faith, or I accept science. And it's not. You can accept both.
Wonderful. So let's move on a little bit to, if you don't mind, talk a little bit about some of your work at the Dortmund Center. What are some of and you mentioned a key takeaway before, I think, in terms of the issue of suffering and how prevalent that is and how quickly that comes up. But what are some of the key takeaways or lessons or interesting encounters you've had from your work?
Yeah, it's a great question. So it's really interesting. Europe Europeans will follow American culture, and American culture very much influences Europe. But in terms of maybe, how do we say this? In terms of the progression of culture, or even the evolution of culture, I think Europe is very much ahead of the US. And I think if you want to see where America is going to be in 20 or 30 or 40 years, look at Europe today, and you'll see where America will be in 20 or 30 or 40 years. And so I think one of the biggest things I've learned doing this type of ministry and engaging with people on this conversation about science and faith is, it's great to have answers. It's great to have worldviews and perspectives. It's great to have research and data. It's great to have laid out arguments that are well reasoned and sound. But in terms of actually changing people's hearts and minds, the work of apologetics doesn't really do very much. What's important to people is, and even in Germany, where they're far more, we wouldn't think of Germany as a warm culture where people are engaged, having people over to each other's houses and being friendly. We tend to think of German culture as being a little bit colder and a little bit more social distance, so to speak. But even here in Germany, the importance of being respectful, of being kind, of presenting your opponent's view in the best possible way. I have frequent conversations with a couple who are atheists, and they love to have conversations about this. But they've never walked away from one of my conversations and said, you made a really good point about the existence of God. I'm going to have to give that some more thought. Or they've never said to me, your mentioning of Alvin Plantinga's argument about a trans-world depravity, that was intriguing. I want to talk to you more about that. I've never had anyone say anything like that to me. What I have had people say is, when I talk to you, you don't get angry. When I talk to you, you always seem to try to understand my side. When I talk to you, we always have such a great time and have such a great conversation. And I wish when I talked about my atheism, when I talked about my lack of belief and my views on religion with other Christians, I wish they responded the way you did. You're not aggressive. You don't become angry or feel threatened. You just talk and we have a good time. Can we get together and talk more? So I think one of the biggest things I've learned is that you can write books and have great arguments and perspectives and worldviews, but if you lack love and compassion, respect, these things, then, like the Apostle Paul says in 13, then we're just really like sounding gongs and clashing cymbals. We got to have love in what we do and in what we say. Otherwise, it's completely worthless.
Wow, that's pretty profound. That's amazing. In fact, it's interesting. I'm going to be starting running a Bible study on evangelism in the next couple of weeks, and I'm going to replay this clip because I think that's really powerful. So it really is about making a personal connection and the way you present. Yeah, that's fabulous. That's wonderful. So what are some of the more, you've had this YouTube channel for a while now. What are some of the more interesting sort of topics that you've explored, and where are you going in the next season?
Yeah, great. That's a great question. So I kind of wanted to start with the basics of science and faith and just kind of lay out some simple things so that whether you're kind of a seasoned science and faith debater or someone who has no idea that the field of science and religion is even a field that you can engage in. I wanted to kind of lay the groundwork and let people know, hey, this is where you can start. And that's what season 1 was all about, was just the very basics of science and religion. And then in season 2, we kind of took a little bit of a different approach. We covered a slightly different theme. But now in season 3, I wanted to go a little bit more in depth with the theology of science and faith. So talking more specifically about the different perspectives. And so we're going to cover like, what is Young Earth Creationism? What is Old Earth Creationism? What is intelligent design? And what is the different perspectives, different interpretations of Genesis. And one of the things I do in this season that I hope ends up being really popular with people, I hope people really like this, is I'm open about my views on being an evolutionary creationist. I'm very open about my transformation from a young earth creationist to fully accepting evolutionary science. But what I don't do in this season, which is I've never seen done before, is I don't argue against other positions. So instead, one of the first episodes, which is actually up now already, is what is young earth creationism? Now, I think it'd be very easy to lay out young earth creationism.
Yeah, you did a great job with that. I listened to it, watched it. It was fabulous.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, I think it would be great, very easy to just say, okay, here's young earth creationism. Okay, and here's why I disagree with it, and here's why it's all wrong.
Yep.
But I just stop and I just say, here's young earth creationism, and I try to present it as if I'm a young earth creationist still. I go back to years ago when I was young earth creationist, and I say, if I was a young earth creationist, what would I want people to know about young earth creationism? How would I say it so that I would be persuasive and help people to understand this view? And I try to present it in the best possible light, and then I just stop. And I say, and this is young earth creationism. This is what they say, and this is what they argue, and then I just stop, and I let people just enjoy that. Just take in what young earth creationists believe. And then the next video, we're going to do old earth creationism. And then the next video, intelligent design. And then eventually we come to evolutionary creation, and I present every view and say, this is what the views are. I feel like if you want to argue different positions and you want to argue whether or not young earth creationism or old earth creationism is true or not, there's any forum, any number of forums you can join. There's endless number of Facebook groups you can join, and you can argue to your heart's content. But I don't know that people want to watch another video with somebody slamming their view. So I just present people's views and say, in the best possible light I can, and say, here's their view. What do you think? You make up your mind. Because for me, as I accept evolutionary creation, I don't care necessarily if somebody comes away watching my videos and go, yeah, okay, I'm a young earth creationist. My goal is not to convert people to evolutionary creation. I would much rather let people know that there are other views out there that you can hold to and still be a Christian. That to me is more important than saying, you're a young earth creationist, you got to accept evolutionary science. If you take that approach, it's never going to work anyway. But if you say you're a young earth creationist, well, you can believe in evolution and be a Christian, and here's why. You can believe in an old earth and be a Christian, and here's why. I think that might be a little bit more effective in getting people to be respectful of other people's views.
So in terms of trying to make progress in that area, what do you think about the outlook for the future of the church as far as, I mean, as an evolutionary creationist, I sometimes feel like I don't fit in very well, and it's hard to find church communities where I feel like I can be open with what I believe and not get pushback. What do you? Maybe it's different in Europe. Maybe this is more of a U.S. thing. But what do you think about the future of the church as far as moving past arguments on these issues and coming to more of an acceptance of a culture of respectfulness of different views on this topic?
Yeah, well, I mean, we were talking about it a minute ago, the difference between, using well-reasoned arguments and being persuasive, and actually just being kind and respectful to people, and patient when you're engaging with them, and showing love, otherwise just being a clashing symbol. I think that's going to be one of the keys going forward, is demonstrating love and kindness and respectfulness and listening when other people talk, and not listening for the sake of waiting till they're finished so that you can respond, but actually taking the time to try to understand where someone else is coming from, the experiences they've had, why they formulated the opinions they've had, and just learning to appreciate them as a human being. Do I have hope that the conversation and the tone of the conversation can change? Do I have hope that there's more acceptance for the theory of evolution in the future? I do, but we're not going to get there unless we actually are proactive about it. we're going to actually have to do the work to make a change. It's not going to happen by itself. And I've written articles for Biologos on this about, coming out, quote unquote, as an evolutionary creationist in the evangelical world, or, what to do if you're part of a church that has an explicit statement in their statement on faith, in the church's statement of faith about young earth creationism, and you believe in evolution. What do you do? Part of my pastoral heart breaks when I have to write an article like that, because knowing that there's people sitting in the pew Sunday after Sunday who can't be honest about their own views, it's sad. We shouldn't have to write articles about that. But if we're ever going to be in a place as a church where we don't have to write articles about that anymore, we have to write articles about it. We have to talk about it. We have to actually do the work to get the church to be in a place where they're accepting of ideas. And so I think one of the things you can do if you are a person who accepts evolutionary science is talk with your pastor about it, make sure they're okay with it, and offer to co-teach a class, like a Sunday school class, or do like a special weekend seminar where you and maybe somebody else from a different position, maybe a young earth or old earth creationist or intelligent design person, you work together as a team to not argue, not debate, not get the issues out, but to present to the church. So let's say, for example, I'm a young earth creationist and John, you're a evolutionary creationist. You and I go to the same church, we're friends. So maybe you and I co-teach a class and we offer it to the whole church, and you come, and I'm going to present all the young earth creationist perspectives. I'm going to be kind, I'm going to be patient, and I'm going to be loving and respectful. And then next week, you're going to present the evolutionary creation view, and people are going to listen and be respectful. And you and I set the tone in our interaction and in how we treat each other and treat each other's views for the rest of the church. We kind of model by example. And what that says is, hey, you might be a young earth creationist, but this guy, he loves Jesus and he accepts evolution, and we're going to love him like a brother. And hey, you might accept evolutionary science, but this guy believes in 6 literal 24-hour days. But you know what? He loves Jesus. And we're going to be kind to each other, and we're going to love each other like brothers and sisters in Christ.
Oh, wonderful, wonderful. So I'd like to end the interview with one final question, and this is a question of interest for me. So, I've traveled in Europe in the past, but I haven't lived there it's been a long time. And in the U.S., what we hear about Europe is that in terms of Christianity, it's sort of dead. It's no one goes to church. The church is dwindling. How accurate is that, and what kind of hope do you have or not have for the growth of Christianity in Europe going forward over the next decade?
Yeah, that's a great question. I've been reading a lot, being in the church planting missions world. You come across a lot of articles, and people send you stuff all the time, and they're like, hey, is this true? And one of the things that the experts are saying is that by 2050, the majority of Christians, the majority of churches, and the majority of theology is going to be coming out of Africa. Africa is sort of where it's at. It's the most rapidly growing number of churches, the most rapidly growing number of Christians and conversions. It's the most rapidly growing field of publications for theology articles, theology books, and perspectives. It's the hotspot. And by 2050, the world's majority of Christians will be coming in and out of Africa. And I'm sure that's true, and that's probably true. But I think there's one major dangerous assumption that people make when they write articles like that, and that is that they assume that they know what the Holy Spirit is doing and they can predict. And I just don't think it's healthy to go there. We have no idea. God is at work all over the entire world, and there's stories from missionaries all over the world about the works that God's doing in places that most people don't even know exist. So it's exciting. And as far as here in Europe, I would say Europe is a big place and it's very multicultural. So no matter what somebody says about Europe, it's probably true. Is the church in Europe dead? Yes. Is the church in Europe exploding and on fire and God's doing things that have never been seen before? Yes. So it's just such a big place, and there's so many cultures here, and it's you can't say any one thing is absolutely certain about it. I will say this: when I first moved here in 2017, I had a German pastor pull me aside in my first month of living here, and he said, "Let me explain something to you about what's going on in Germany, because you're going to be a church planter here. You need to know." Germany as a culture was very closed to the gospel, to Christianity, to religion. It was everything here in terms of religion was dead. In 2015, the German government essentially invited and brought in over 2 million immigrants from Syria and Iraq and from the Middle East and all over North Africa. What that did to German society was it took a perfectly ordered society, very white, very orderly, very organized, and it completely turned it upside down on its head. And now what you had was a multiracial, multi-ethnic, multicultural society where you had people coming from other cultures where organization wasn't that big of a deal. Being on time just didn't matter. And it completely turned German worlds upside down, and it turned their hearts upside down. And for the first time, they felt weak, they felt vulnerable, they felt exposed. German people felt insecure. And what that did was it gave the church in Germany, unprecedented access to the German people. And for the first time in people can't even remember how long, Germans were open to hearing the gospel. And what we've seen across Germany in the last 6 years are church planting movements that are spreading like wildfire across not only Germany, but across all of Europe. There are hundreds of churches being planted every single year. There are thousands of people coming to faith across Europe every single year. And so is Europe dead? Of course not. And we would never say that. It's a spiritually dead or dark place, because Jesus is the risen King of the world, and his kingdom is going forth and conquering, and the very gates of hell are not going to prevail against it. And so the kinds of things that we see going on in Europe, maybe they don't happen as quickly, maybe they don't happen in as big a numbers as you see in places like South Asia or Africa or South America. But miracles are happening in Europe. People are coming to Christ in Europe. Churches are getting planted in Europe. And it's because Jesus is risen, he is the King, and we follow not a dead Lord, but a risen Savior. And it's exciting work to be a part of.
Awesome. Awesome. Well, and that's a great note to end on. And really appreciate your time, Mario. And just God bless you. And thank you so much for being here with us.
Thanks, John. Thanks for having me.
All right. Take care.